It's great to see so many of you this evening for a very nice night focused on this magnificent organ that we have in our head, the human brain. I welcome you on behalf of Studium Generale Groningen and the University Museum. And Studium Generale, as hopefully many of you know, is part of the Hanse and University of Groningen, and it organizes innovative and multidisciplinary activities in the field of science, culture and society. And this program contains lectures, films, debates and more. You can see many examples here behind me on the screen. And if you like, you can also subscribe to the newsletter, so then just go to the website of Studium Generale. This evening is in the series of collector's items. The University Museum in Groningen manages an extensive collection of objects. Since the founding of the university in 1614, this collection of academic heritage has grown into one of the most beautiful and largest collections in the North. In the series Collector's Items, Studium Generale offers a kaleidoscopic cross-section of this vast collection of more than 1,000 objects, providing a beautiful and sometimes even surprising insight into the development of science. My name is Marie-José van Tol. I work here at the University of Groningen and University Medical Center Groningen as professor of cognitive neuropsychiatry, and thereby I consider myself a brain scientist as well, and therefore it's an extra pleasure to host this evening and welcome our brain scientist. I'll introduce them to you later, but first I would like to let you know what we're going to do this evening. You've probably already seen this magnificent model of the brain. We will start by saying a few words about that. Then the lectures of our three speakers, Franciska de Beer, Audrey Rousse-Malpat and Wouter Kruijne will be given. And then there's time for a question and answer session, and preferably not by ChatGPT. And then we will close the evening with a short explanation of the Wetenschap op Woensdag poster. So when you enter this building, you've seen many very nice visual representations with intriguing facts, and we will tell you a bit about that too. This series tonight is called Brainstorm, and that's also the name of an exhibition that you can visit at the University Museum from Saturday on. Also there, this model of the brain will be shown, so you can have another look in better detail, but also learn much more about the brain. And we hope to see you all there. Also, because you're here tonight, you will receive an email with a code to get a discount for your ticket to visit the museum. So we hope to see you all there. So let's move to this object. It is called a brain model, or in Dutch, hersenmodel, and it's been constructed by F.R. Buggy. And in Dutch, the title is Hersenmodel met zenuwbanen van ijzerdraad, de ganglionen van Kirk naar hun functie, gegroepeerd in diverse kleuren. So that's a very technical description of what it is. It's made of iron wire. There is some cork involved in it, used for it, and it has been grouped into its function according to certain color coding. This model of the human brain, in which nerve fibers and the emotional areas were made visible, so it's not a brain model that includes all brain parts, but the ones that are important for our emotional processes. And this model was used to train doctors and to conduct research on the human mind. The 19th century design was so successful that more than 20 medical and biological institutes from around the world wanted their own. So this is a model for many more models used to teach a lot of brain scientists. And this is the central item of this evening, and we've invited, and we're very happy that they're here, 3 brain scientists. So people who study the function of the human brain, and they will tell you all about that. So in the coming hour, we will hear the presentation from first Franciska de Beer, then Audrey Rousse-Malpat, and then Wouter Kruijne will end. And after that, there's the possibility to ask questions. So I think I would like to welcome Franciska to the floor. And very curious to hear.
Good evening. Great to see so many of you here. My name is Franciska de Beer, and I'm a PhD student and a neuroscientist in the group of Professor Audrey Rousse-Malpat. And today we are going to talk about what partially this brain model, and what I really like about this brain model is that all parts and bits and pieces seem to be connected, which is true for your brain. Your brain has about 86 billion neurons, and they all interact and connect with each other to keep everything up and running. Which is also why you will see in the exhibition of Brainstorm that, for instance, some disorders that look so different, say psychosis or Parkinson's disease, may actually have more in common than you think. But of course, your brain doesn't look quite like this. Actually, your brain looks more like this. This is a jelly pudding, and your brain feels it has the consistency of a jelly pudding. So very soft, right? Just for safety. And your brain is bright pink, as this one is. So now I have a question for you. How many calories do you think your brain uses on an average day? This is multiple choice. Is it 1 apple? Is it 2 apples? Is it 3 apples? Or is it even 4 apples? And now I want to see some hands. Who goes for 1 apple? Who goes for 2 apples? Who goes for 3 apples? Yeah, it's all quite some hands. Who goes for 4 apples? The majority. You're well informed. Those who voted for 4 apples are correct. Your brain uses about 435 calories a day, which equals about 4 big apples. And those of you who answered correctly, well, that might feel pretty good, doesn't it? You're only a few minutes into this lecture and you already answered a question correctly, so well done. But why does it feel nice to have answered a question correctly? Well, that I will explain to you in the coming few minutes. Because it all has to do with dopamine. And dopamine is known as this molecule of happiness. To be honest, it is pretty good. Dopamine makes you feel great, absolutely amazing, rewarded, motivated. With dopamine, you can take on the world. So, sounds like free happiness, and more the better, right? But is that really true? Is dopamine really this molecule of happiness? In this talk, I will explain to you that dopamine also has a dark side, and that it can make you unhappy. And it's all about finding the right balance. But let's start with, what is dopamine actually? Dopamine is a messenger chemical in the brain. We call them neurotransmitters. And they transmit a message from one neuron to the other. And in your brain, you have about 100 of these neurotransmitters that we know of. And each has their specific function, specific message they bring across. And I will talk about 3 functions of dopamine. So the first one, I like to call dopamine as the molecule of bingo. So whenever something nice happens to you, it's bingo, this boost of dopamine, and you feel great, this rewarded, pleasurable feeling. So say someone would walk into this room and will give you an apple, or better, an ice cream. And you would eat this ice cream, and what bingo will be this boost of dopamine, and you feel great. Well, at that moment, dopamine actually functions as this highlighter, this marker of your life, saying, this is nice, you should remember this because this is good. And then what you remember is the location. Where are you at this point? With which people are you at that moment? How did that feel? And what did you do to get that ice cream? And in that sense, dopamine is important for learning. And dopamine you get from everything you enjoy. Coffee, alcohol, sex, drugs, sports, but also getting a compliment, having a nice social conversation, and chocolate. Chocolate absolutely gives you dopamine. The thing with chocolate is that when you have one piece, you may want another one, and maybe yet another one. And that brings me to the second function of dopamine. It's the molecule of more. With dopamine, you are motivated to pursue more. Motivated to pursue short-term goals, such as I want a cup of coffee or a bit of chocolate. But also long-term goals, like running a marathon or getting a master's degree. So I'm a PhD student, I'm very motivated to get my PhD degree, but also to be social, to be kind to people. And then there's the third function of dopamine, and that is it's the move maker. Dopamine is important for movement, and especially for starting movements, but also to keep your balance. And it's important to suppress movements you don't want. So I want to keep my arm fixed, meaning that I have to suppress movements that otherwise would make it tremble. So to sum up, we have three functions of dopamine. It's the bingo molecule, it's the molecule of more, making you motivated, and it's the move maker, important for movements, to make them run smoothly. Okay, so that's nice, but where is it made in your brain? Well, you see this slide, and on the slide you see a black area, we call that substantia nigra, and a red area, we call it a ventral tegmental area. And in those regions are the cells that produce dopamine. And overall, they produce dopamine, and you have a bit in storage, because, you need dopamine when there's a surprise. So you need some bit, you can have it when you need it. And for most people, this is produced, or you have dopamine levels, well, that may fluctuate a bit from day to day, or you have some more in the morning when you need to be motivated to get out of bed, and less so in the evening. But for most people, this will be a bit on and off, but overall in balance. And when it's in balance, well, you could say that dopamine is this molecule of happiness. It's important to make you feel nice, pleasurable, rewarded, motivated, good for movement, so very happy. But dopamine can also have this dark side and make you unhappy. And today I will discuss two instances where there's either too much or too little dopamine. And let's start with what happens if there's too much dopamine. One disorder where there is too much dopamine is psychosis. So during a psychosis, there is too much dopamine in an area we call the striatum, and that's the purple area. It's actually hidden behind this purple area. And during a psychosis, people often experience hallucinations. And hallucinations are seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting things that aren't really there. Say, I see snakes crawling across the ceiling. Well, there aren't really any snakes. Or I hear a voice, as if there's someone standing next to me, talking to me, but there isn't someone. And often these voices say very unkind things, such as, this lecture is horrendous, and you should have prepared better. And with a psychosis, people may experience delusions, and delusions or ideas or beliefs that are clearly not true, but are held with great conviction. So you think you're hearing my voice, but in fact, that is someone who implanted a chip in my head, and it's their voice you're hearing. And the third characteristic of a psychosis is that people have thoughts or behavior that are chaotic or disorganized. And how does dopamine play a role in all this? Well, I just told you that dopamine is this marker of your life. It highlights what's important. But what if too many things are highlighted as important? Well, they are actually not. So I'm not sure whether you've seen it, but all chairs are blue, except that one, that's red. Red is a sign of danger, and that is exactly in my line, so it can't be a good sign. So what if something feels important and your brain starts to make a reason of it, of why that would feel so important? So then we can ask ourselves the question, okay, but how do you get too much or too little dopamine? How does this balance, if this balance is so important, shift? Well, for apsychosis, we don't exactly know how it emerges. We don't exactly know what triggers someone to be psychotic and other one not. And most likely it's not just one factor, but there are multiple ones, and they add up. For instance, we know genetics play a role, but there are some other risk factors we can point to, which are stress, sleep, especially a lack of sleep, not sleeping a lot, and trauma, and especially then trauma during childhood, which is also why soldiers who may be under a lot of pressure, a lot of stress, are often sleep deprived and have seen terrible things, are at greater risk of experiencing psychotic symptoms. And drugs. Of course, drugs can also increase this level of dopamine. Very notorious are amphetamine and cocaine. And they don't give just this small peak of dopamine. They give a massive heap of dopamine. And during that time, you can feel absolutely great, very motivated, a lot of pleasure. But you can also experience hallucinations. And your body uses quite a lot of your dopamine reserves to get to this peak. But it also means that your body doesn't have the ingredients to make that much dopamine to go to a normal level, so you crash to a low. And during that low, you can feel very unmotivated, not wanting to get off the couch and maybe even have some shaky hands, symptoms of dopamine deficiency. And it will take a while before your body has the enough ingredients to get back to these regular levels again. So we talked about too much dopamine, which happens in people with psychosis. So what happens when there is too little dopamine? And one of the illnesses where there is too little dopamine is Parkinson's disease. So in Parkinson's disease, cells that produce dopamine, they die off. And these cells are located in this black area called the substantia nigra. And I just told you that your brain is bright pink, right? Which is true, all your brain cells are pinkish in color, except for one group. One group of cells is black. That's what they're called, substantia nigra. Why are these cells black? Well, they produce dopamine, but as a byproduct, they also produce something we call neuromelanin. And neuromelanin has a black pigment, and that makes these cells black. And these black cells die off. So in a brain of someone with Parkinson's disease, well, you would see fewer of these black spots. And that gives, well, as you have fewer cells that make this dopamine, you have fewer levels of dopamine, and that gives symptoms. And typically these symptoms are movement symptoms. At least they are very well known, right? Shaky hands, stiff muscles, problem with maintaining balance and easy to trip over. But also they have emotional problems, sometimes a little less well known. Not feeling very motivated to get out of the couch, or not feeling pleasure anymore in the things that used to be nice. So then you could ask the question, well, if this is a balance issue, and can't we just restore this balance? Give dopamine and a pill, right? Well, restoring this balance is not as easy as it seems, and the right treatment will depend per person, per situation. But often people with psychosis and Parkinson's disease, they need professional treatment, and that often includes medication as well. And you could say that medication for psychosis and Parkinson's, they really try to restore this dopamine balance. So take Parkinsonism. Medication for Parkinson's disease, they try to mimic dopamine in the brain. One very well used drug is called levodopa or L-dopa. And that is a precursor of dopamine. Precursor means that it's the main ingredient your body uses to make dopamine. And with levodopa, you have more dopamine level, higher dopamine levels, and that helps to move more smoothly and feel more motivated. But it also comes with side effects, because if medication stimulates these dopamine levels too much, people can experience hallucinations, or they can have addictions. So actually quite common in Parkinson's disease is shopping addiction, gambling, or sex addiction. With psychosis, it's the other way around. With psychosis, the medication, called antipsychotic medication, tries to lower these dopamine signaling in the brain. And that helps to have fewer hallucinations and fewer delusions. But then also there are the risks of side effects. Not feeling motivated anymore, not feeling a lot of pleasure in the things that used to be very nice. And people can have movement problems, shaky hands, stiff muscles, problems with maintaining balance, and we call these movement problems Parkinsonism. So there you see that this balance is crucial, it's very important, but it's really difficult to achieve. At the University Medical Center, for instance, my PhD thesis, but more research in the group of, for instance, Professor Iris Sommer, is focused on how can we prescribe the medication in such a way that someone has an effective antipsychotic medication, but there is not too many side effects, so we restore this dopamine balance as good as possible. If there's anything I'd like you to take away from today, then that is that, well, dopamine can make you very happy, makes you feel rewarded, motivated, move smoothly, but it also has a dark side to it, and that it can also make you very unhappy if you don't have the right balance. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Let's see if it works first. No. Yes, this is me. Hello, my name is Audrey Rousse-Malpat, Audrey Rousse-Malpat in French. And I'm an assistant professor at the Faculty of Arts for the program of European Languages and Cultures. And I research and I teach how you learn languages. And that's what we will talk about today. If you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. This quote from Nelson Mandela perfectly captures why we should all continue to cultivate an interest in learning each other's languages. Sure, it is practical to have a global language like English to connect us. It makes evenings like tonight possible. Maar niks komt in je hart dieper dan de klank van de woorden in jouw eigen taal. Nothing resonates more deeply than the sound of the words in your mother tongue. And think about that feeling when you hear a foreigner speak your language fluently. It's like awe-inspiring, isn't it? It's not just about grammar and vocabulary, it's about the journey. Because learning a language isn't just an intellectual exercise. It is an emotional roller coaster. It takes time, it takes courage, and the willingness to endure moments of complete and utter embarrassment. As you know, trust me, I speak 4 languages fluently, and each one was learned through love. The love of the unknown, the love of human connection, and ultimately, the love of a very handsome Dutch man that I met on the Atlantic coast when I was 19. I don't have a picture, but I share this because too many people believe that learning English as a second language is enough. to get by. But I know from experience and from research that true human connection comes from embracing linguistic diversity. Variety is the spice of life, after all. And tonight I hope to show you that learning a foreign language isn't just useful, it's good for your health, good for your soul, and honestly, it's a whole lot of fun. My work as a researcher and teacher revolves around understanding how people learn languages. I study how teenagers acquire French and German in the classroom. And let me tell you a little secret. Dutch teenagers are not learning foreign languages as well as they could. They are great at multiple choice tests, but ask them to have a simple conversation with a native speaker and panic sets in. And this kills their motivation, in fact. It's not the difficulty of the language that discourages them. It's the feeling that they aren't actually learning anything useful. One of my students even discovered in her thesis that some learners would rather study Chinese than French for the simple reason that they say that Chinese is hard, but at least they are learning something. They crave a challenge, in fact. Science tells us that we learn languages best through exposure and use. The way we acquire our first language is not at all that different from how we learn a second one. Our brain is wired for language. It is a vast network of meanings in connection. This is where I draw a parallel with art, just like this artwork. Language is in our brain. It's not stored in isolated compartments. It is an intricate web of connections, really much more like that. And when we scan the brain, we see different regions that light up working together when we use languages. And the languages we speak, they don't exist in separate mental drawers. They intertwine, ready to surface when needed. But like an unused muscle, these connections fade if we don't practice. I think many of us experience that, the feeling that we forget the languages we used to know. So how do we keep these connections alive? By immersing learners in the language. Not in a way that is too hard or too easy, but in a way that challenges them just enough. We need to help them find patterns, repeat them, reuse them, and most importantly, we need to teach them to make mistakes, especially in the beginning. Learning a language is like learning to swim. Actually, that was my quote that I submitted for this project. And I was very happy to see the artwork that was made about it. It's just outside if you want to look at it when you go out. So it's more like learning how to swim. Think back. Your swimming lessons. Did your instructor explain all the movements, then pushed you into the water and yelled at you every time your arms were in position correctly? Well, no, because you would have drowned by then. But instead, what you do is that you eased into the water, you watch others, how they do, you imitate their movements, you make endless mistakes, and slowly fear disappears, confidence grows. It's cognitive and even fun sometimes, just like language learning. So language learning works a bit the same way. It's a cognitive activity, but it's also deeply emotional. And this is why the role of the teachers, especially in high school, is crucial. My research confirms that you absolutely can learn a language in a classroom. It is possible, even if it's not spoken outside of it. With modern technology, we can create immersive environments with films and series and podcasts and TED Talks and endless other resources. But ultimately, it's the teacher who must create a safe space where mistakes are welcomed and learning is an adventure. Now let's do a little experiment together. I want you to experience what it's like to be a total beginner in a language and feel how naturally your brain tries to make sense of what you hear. So I'll use a language that doesn't exist. It's called the Bamba language. So let's see. You're with me?
Yes.
Okay. Bamba, trekabubu skoink, skoink todobeki lavatai. No? Okay, let's try it another way. So you do what I do, or you say what I say. Bamba.
Bamba.
Treka bubu. Bamba. Treka bubu. Bamba. Todobeki. Treka bubu. Todobeki deep. Bamba. Todobeki deep. Bamba. Treka bubu. Treka bubu. Todobeki lubatai. Todobeki lubatai. Todobeki lubatai. Treka bubu. Lubatai. Treka bubu. Todobeki lubatai. Treka bubu. Todobeki skoink. Treka bubu skoink. Todobeki asbatai. Okay, so how was that? So did your brain start to do something? Start to take the pieces together? Was it a little fun to do it? Well, I hope so. The good news is that my colleagues studying mental health and aging have found that learning a new language, even after 65, is incredibly beneficial. It's a bit the quote that's here, but we know also much more about that now. It keeps the brain sharp, it fosters social connections, it adds richness to life. So when you go home tonight, sign up for that French class you always wanted. Step over the fear, the shame, the awkwardness of being a beginner. Do it for your mind, but also for your soul, and to show that foreign languages have a future in this country. Because it's not about chatting with your ski instructor in Austria or understanding Monsieur Aznavour in its original version. It's about embracing the spice of life. Because, as William Cowper once said, variety is the very spice of life. It gives it all its flavor. As a final note, I would like to draw your attention to many campaigns to inspire people to be teachers. As a society, we kind of failed to attract a new generation of teachers, and we can feel it in the classrooms already. There is a major shortage of teachers. And this is bad. because we are in a democracy, and we rely on critical thinking and transmission of knowledge. So, as a gesture of resistance, I would like to ask you to repost those campaigns and talk positively about being a teacher around you, so that we can turn this disaster around. Dank je wel. Merci. Veel dank. Thank you.
Hello. So, I have the honor of being the last speaker. My name is Wouter Kruijne, and as you can see on this slide, I work in the experimental psychology department of the Faculty of Behavioral Social Sciences Psychology Department in Groningen. And as the name experimental psychology suggests, we do experiments. We do a ton of experiments. We do a lot of experiments, all with relatively the same goal, which is very similar to the goal with which this beautiful object was created, is that we somehow try to locate or figure out what parts of the brain are involved in solving which types of tasks. And classically, we sort of try to locate all of these different functions and sort of pinpoint, as it says here, the manager of speech is in the top right. Well, advancing knowledge has taught us that language is all over the brain, as you've just heard. So we know a little bit more than this picture suggests, but a lot of our methodology still revolves around the same procedure. So we put people in front of a computer screen, sometimes with an EEG cap on their head, and then we have them do all sorts of funky experiments. I love this picture because this man looks so disinterested. He's staring at a login screen, and I think this is an EEG cap for a baby, so I don't think he should be wearing this. But I love the mind-crushing idea that this conveys, that some of our experiments also convey. But whatever kind of experiment we do, what we always see, what kind of tasks, and I will walk you through a bunch of types of tasks that we do and that we study. What I find fascinating is that whatever we do, I always observe the same thing in my experiments, and hopefully also throughout your lives as you're doing all sorts of funky cognitive tasks, is that practice makes perfect. So throughout the experiment, people will get better at whatever they do. This is another one of my favorite pictures because it's so ugly. I have to read this one day. So what is happening throughout these extremely boring experiments that I do that still makes people better at solving some sort of cognitive task? And, well, what happens throughout one of these tasks is a lot of things. So in practice, there's a lot of stuff involved. But what I'm most interested in is the role of this little structure that is called the hippocampus. So hippocampus is Latin for a little seahorse. And if you have some kind of vivid imagination, it sort of looks like a little sideways seahorse. We have two of them, one on the left, one on the right. And they are involved in, classically, in the creation of what we call episodic memories. So, for example, here's an episodic memory that you might have of a very lovely birthday that you had as a child. So the way this works in the hippocampus is that this event consists of a whole bunch of stimuli. There were bells and whistles and balloons, people were cheering, people were singing, you got all sorts of funky gifts. What the hippocampus does is that it, and I mean, don't tell me how, but it represents space. So where were you at the time of your, let's say, 6th birthday? And the time, so around the year that this was happening. And the hippocampus is just constantly sorting all of our experiences into time and space, and that's the basis for how we build memories. Now, what I find fascinating is that we can't shut it off. It's always making these memories. It's just that a lot of them are so boring that we never bother to retrieve them anyway. But we can't help it. They're always there. Even in the boring experiments that I do. And so one illustration that I always find very convincing about this ongoing process in the hippocampus and how strong this is in an experiment where people were presented with all sorts of pictures of objects and had to answer all sorts of questions about this. So for example, I could show you a picture of a lion and I could ask you, can you please say whether this is an animate or an inanimate object? This is one of the favorite questions of these types of cognitive psychologists. Another question that people love to ask is, does this fit in a shoebox, yes or no? Don't ask me why. We have paradigms, we do the weirdest things. And so, for example, you can just sit there and every trial in my experiment you get presented with a picture and at some point this lion comes up and I ask you, does this fit in a shoebox? And you think, well, a lion's a little big, I guess not. So you press no and you press the key that I tell you to press as quick as possible. Now, if you come back a week later and I show you the exact same lion in a paradigm where the question is still, well, does it fit, is this larger than a shoebox, for example, and you have to answer with a different key, you will be faster or slower dependent on how much of the task repeats. So if I ask you the exact same thing again, is this animal, does it fit in a shoebox, and you press no with the exact same button, you will be relatively fast. If a week later I've swapped the buttons around, then the memory of pressing with your right hand in response to the lion will make you slower if a week later I let you respond with your left hand, even though you're doing exactly the same thing. And so at all of these levels of processing, these memories are being formed and they're guiding our behavior even though we're not particularly aware of these things happening. So I study this phenomenon of these intrusive memories affecting our behavior outside of awareness in all sorts of situations. In my PhD, I did a lot of work on visual search. I will not show you one of the boring search displays that we do, but I will tell you an anecdote of how I experienced one of my own phenomena myself. Who here does not know what this is? Okay, so a very Dutch audience, I assume. So this is the kind of sign that a lot of Dutch people sometimes plan their holidays or plan their holiday trips around. I, for most of my teenage years, had no clue what this was. I had never seen any of these things before. Until one summer, me and my girlfriend at the time planned a bicycling holiday where we had to constantly search for these things for a whole week. Now I see them everywhere, but I'm not just good at detecting them and recognizing them, that's one thing, but I'm also very good at finding them when they're particularly hidden. So my visual attention is being trained by these memories of searching constantly for a week long for these stupid signs that might be hidden behind a tree somewhere. Nowadays, I study this phenomenon of constantly learning as you're doing these experiments a lot in tasks that involve temporal preparation. So this is particularly relevant for example, speed skaters. You might be aware that there's this ongoing controversy in speed skating about that there is always a person saying ready and then shooting the starting gun. Every person is different, so every starter is different, but it's a character of the sport that this is a person and not some sort of machine that does this or some automated process. But this means that as other skaters are waiting for their turn and waiting for their round to actually take a leg, they are learning the dynamics of this particular starter. And we actually do experiments to show that this is indeed true, that people can't help but learn what the dynamics are of the ready start interval that is regular for this particular starter. So some sprinters like Dai Natap, they get fouled for starting wrong twice and then they spend the rest of their career crying about how this is unfair and this should be changed. But he's right. This is completely unfair. We should either automate this or we should just completely randomize the starting order. So, back to the hippocampus and what the hippocampus means to me. We can't switch it off. This little seahorse that is somewhere stuck in our brain is constantly involved in making these memories. And so I think life is all about making memories. And I hope to have convinced you that all of these memories matter, not just the ones that you remember from your birthday, but all of the memories that influence your behavior in the future. This wasn't as smooth as an ending as I had hoped, but thank you anyway.
Thank you so much for 3 excellent talks. I would like to give another round of applause because it was really a treat for our brains, or at least that's how I experienced it. Now the floor is open for questions, so I'd like to know who has a question for one of the speakers. Yeah, maybe you can join me here.
And I have a mic for you. And also for the person who wants to ask a question.
And yeah, that's fine. Also, if you'd like to ask your question but you don't know how to do it in English, please ask it in Dutch. We can translate so everyone in the room can understand. But please ask your questions. But first...
Okay, let me try in English. I heard and read some articles about that Parkinson, the place in the brain where Parkinson involves, or how you call it, it should be stimulated positive by playing tennis or by boxing. By boxing. What do you know about that?
That's a very good question. Well, indeed, so movement, doing sports as a treatment for Parkinson's is widely recommended, and it has been shown to improve the bodily movements. I'm not an expert on movements necessarily, but I would expect that practicing what we just had, the pitch of practice makes perfect. If you do keep practice your movements, it will become smoother and smoother throughout. But I can't exactly detail you how this treatment works, but indeed it has been shown relatively effective.
Maybe just to add, it's not about getting hit in the head that helps. Just in case you were wondering, that's not the benefit of...
Yes, green, yes.
I was wondering whether the overload of dopamine, it was dopamine, right? Whether that only has as a consequence the psychosis, or whether there are also other consequences. And the same with the lack of dopamine. Were it just examples of, or?
Yeah, so those were just examples of what can happen with too much or too little dopamine. So we talked about some symptoms that occur again and again in many instances. So, but these were just some examples. For instance, I haven't talked about addiction, where dopamine also plays a very important role, where people are addicted to a substance. Because I talked about that low, right? When you have too little dopamine, because if you have too, in the case if you have used a drug and you have this extreme peak and then you have this low, well, when you feel so unmotivated and so horrible, it's very tempting to maybe want another glass or maybe another pill, and that is, well, when you're very vulnerable for developing an addiction. So that's another example of a disorder where dopamine plays an important role. Yeah.
I have a question to the first speaker. First of all, thank you for your talk. It was amazing. I also have another question to the second speaker, but I will first ask the first question. So I am wondering whether there are any differences between men and women when it comes to psychosis, to the risks and experiencing psychosis.
That's a very good question. Well, there are some differences between men and women, but perhaps sometimes not as many as we think. So let me explain that to you. We have the idea that psychosis happens way more often in men than in women, which is true. If you look at a very young population, if you look at a very young group of people, there will be more men who experience psychosis than women. But then the interesting thing is that men typically have their first psychotic experience very young, early in age, and that sort of declines again. Then there's a lower risk. For women, however, that also emerges, and it's around 25, then there's a sort of increased risk. But then that is a plateau that seems to go throughout, and women are vulnerable for instance, psychotic symptoms at other periods. For instance, during menopause, when there are fluctuations in hormones that makes them vulnerable for psychotic experiences. So in that sense, there is both a similarity and a difference. Yeah.
Thank you for your answer. And I would also want to ask another question to the second speaker. So if I would like to learn a language that is not related to the family of languages that my mother tongue originates from, what would be the best way for me to learn it?
Thank you for your question. And this has been studied by also a big project in America for diplomats who were supposed to learn quickly foreign languages and also languages that were not from their own families. So our family tree of European languages is in fact Indo-European languages. So we share a lot of characteristics with many other languages, also Sanskrit and other languages. But what we found was a key difference that would predict you to spend much more time learning a language is the alphabet difference. So if the alphabet is different from your mother tongue, you will spend a significantly more amount of time to learn that language. And so I guess you will need more time, and also spend that time on that alphabet and on the sounds and immerse yourself as well. Here in our university, we teach Russian, and Russian is still in our family of languages. However, the alphabet is totally different. And our students, they do need more time to study it. And the teachers here, they teach with movies, with a lot of films. And what they do is that they play also a lot of the scenes of the movies, and they speak it out. For French, for example, it will surprise you, but it's easier to learn French by focusing on how you say it instead of how you write it. So if you only focus on speaking for French, it's much easier. So for example, all the irregular verbs are regular when you say them. Je prends, tu prends, il prend, on prend. But when I start to write them, then the problem starts. I hope I answered your question.
Merci beaucoup.
De rien.
Can I continue? I'd like to have a question for the third speaker. Thank you very much. You enjoyed all the talks a lot. To the hippocampus and to the birthday party memory, will the brain use language to store that memory of that birthday party?
So, as far as I understand it, the hippocampus is very often treated as if it's like the store or the little container where all the memories go. But what the hippocampus is particularly good at is organizing memories that are represented throughout the brain and sort of arranging them as where and when did this happen. So the connections with the hippocampus all together form the basis for the memory. So then I would say that once you start adding language into the mix, I would feel like this is part of what gets integrated. So what is being said, or the narrative that we tell ourselves about what's going on during our birthday party. I got a toy car from my aunt. That whole representation, that whole sentence, all of these semantic representations all get bound to me being a little kid on my 6th birthday, sitting on the floor, unpacking my present. So The episodic memory is the integration of all of these events that are going on at the same time. There is an interesting follow-up that I can say, is that these episodic memories, as we retrieve them, we can actually alter them before we store them back. So you could, for example, experience something without having this inner narrative going on, but then as soon as you're telling the story to your kids, to your friends in school the next day, I got a toy car from my aunt. Then that memory gets retrieved, and maybe then the language gets integrated. So yes and no, as so many of these questions go. But yeah.
Thank you very much.
If I may also follow up on that question. So you study mostly the formation of memories, and you showed that the hippocampus is very important for that. We also know that with aging, and specifically Alzheimer's disease, the hippocampus decays. And then my question for you is, how does that hinder language learning at an older age?
There was a twist there.
Yes, you did not expect that, right?
Yeah, so I think we all have this belief or that the older we get, the more difficult it is to learn anything, not only a language, but also a new skill in general. Language is kind of a skill to learn. And that comes from different aspects. We have the feeling also that we remember things less easily, that we can find patterns less easily. So that plays a role. But when you grow older, there are also other problems, such as hearing loss, for example. And the fact that you can hear less accurately also impacts how you learn a language. So the expectations, of course, is I think at all age you can learn a foreign language. I used to teach at the Institut Français here. I've been doing that for quite a long time. And in my classroom, I had a former mathematics professor. He was far in his 90s in my class, and he has hearing aids and everything. But he enjoyed very much the class, and he really learned. But of course, compared to the 18-year-old that was in the classroom next to him, his progress were not as fast.
Thank you.
Thank you for the lecture. I would like to know that what is our brain doing when we are sleeping? And what's the function of sleeping? And when you talk about sleeping, you cannot exclusive the dream. And what does that mean? Yeah, thank you.
I don't think I can answer that. I love sleeping though, but
Yeah.
So, I mean, we have a lot of hypotheses on what exactly is going on in sleeping, and there are probably even people in this room that know a lot more than me. But one of the most prevalent theories is that somehow having the brain not be as active in its cognitive functions as it normally is involves some sort of cleanup processes, that we're actually trying to clear all of the residual chemicals that we produce during the day and try to get rid of it. Another thing that's happening is that the hippocampus is actually very active, and that it's somehow replaying a lot of the memories that were formed during the day. And this seems to play a very important role in consolidation of these memories and making them actually stronger going into the next day. So there are a lot of learning effects that if you study for a test or whatever, that the next day performance is actually improved compared to waiting the same amount of time without sleeping in between. So that's another function of what the function of sleeping is. And obviously, for me, when we talk about sleeping, we can't not talk about dreaming. And that seems to involve, partially driven by the hippocampus, partially driven by all sorts of other processes going on, reactivation of either things that were experienced during the day or things that are associated with what's experienced during the day. And then out of this mess, our consciousness is just trying to make a story out of it. And that story comes out as your dreams. And that's a bit wishy-washy, but I think that's about the level at which we understand the process of dreaming. But if there's anyone here who knows more about dreams and wants to step up, then be my guest.
Yeah.
Thank you. I had a question about the hippocampus as well, about the birthday parties. Why is it more likely that you remember something negative, like a negative experience, than a positive experience?
It might have something to do with just relevant pondering, that people just tend to ponder over these bad memories and just, so you relive a positive experience and think, oh, that was nice. You relive a negative experience and think, what could I have done better? How could I have changed this? How could I? So you have a much more vivid reimagining of the memory if it's a negative case. But we also see that this type of, so the remembering of negative memories is one of these, so these types of intrusive thoughts are very much correlated with all sorts of symptoms. So it's not that by law everyone remembers bad things more so than good things, but that it very much fluctuates across different types of personality that there are.
Thank you.
Er is een wachtlijst, maar ik kom zo bij.
Question voor Wouter. Wat is het verschil? Ik doe het van Nederland. Waarom kan de ene persoon een herinnering echt direct ophalen en echt heel gedetailleerd vertellen waar het was en welke datum? En iemand anders die diezelfde beleving ook heeft gehad, positieve beleving, soms heel erg moet graven en niet exact die datum maar weet. Heb je het dan verschillend beleefd qua emotie of intensiteit?
Yeah, so I'm just going to translate it very quickly. So your question is about what causes the individual differences where some people are just able to immediately retrieve all sorts of memories from their life and others just really seem to have to dig very hard in order to retrieve them. Yeah, so both people were there and you asked them the same amount of time and they differ in, maybe not just in their recollection speeds, but also in the exact recollection of what happened. So there are a lot of different processes that make it differ. Partially this has to do with, indeed, you're paying attention at that particular moment in time. The easiest way to remember something is to actually pay attention. If you're not paying attention, you tend to just forget all sorts of things. But then there are just differences in individuals' skills in categorizing all sorts of events. So I don't know how much of a soccer fan you are, but I'm not. So if you and I would watch a soccer match together, you might be able to just instantly categorize all sorts of events as meaningful that I just see as 22 people running behind the ball in a green blob. And it's not, and so that doesn't just have to do with my attention. I might actually be paying attention, but I have no clue what's going on. So I have no frame of reference, and so it just turns into this 90-minute blob of very impressive sports that I didn't understand. So that is also another way of easily forgetting it, because I just chunk it as a blob of, yeah, well, people who are running, and I know you and I were there, but I didn't pay attention to the game. So those are the primary suspects when it comes to differences in retrieval time. But it might also have something to do with how often you and I recollect this story of, remember the World Cup final of '98 where you and I were watching the game together and this was particularly great and it was one of the best nights of my life. If you happen to do that for 10 years, 20 years, and I don't, then this will also obviously change how easy it is to retrieve it. So we need stuff to be practiced, we need a frame of reference, and we need to pay attention for stuff to be remembered better.
Hi, I wanted to ask, since you said you have to get out there and when you speak a language and learn it to make mistakes, but is there a risk that if you do that, you internalize or get bad habits from those mistakes?
So the risk is what we call fossilization of error, when at a point you've made this mistake so many times that you don't even hear it yourself. But for that to happen, a lot needs to happen before. So a normal development of a beginner is that there is a huge amount of mistakes at the beginning. And these are very important because you create kind of chaos and tryouts and you dare to do things, and this risk-taking is very important in your learning. That's what we see, a lot of chaos before the learning. Normally, so it goes by itself down pretty quickly. I did one study where I studied how Dutch teenagers learn French, and 70% of their writing mistakes disappeared on their own within a year. But for that, you need two key conditions, and that is that you need enough exposure. So you need to have enough good models, good examples around you. You learn a lot from speaking to somebody who is also learning, even though this person makes mistakes. You learn a lot from that. But the condition for you not to overtake his mistake is that you hear the good example around you. So native speakers or expert speakers, that should be enough. Then no worries.
Well, first, thank you for your lectures. Second, I have two questions. The first is, personality is, as I understood, is a definition which made by making experiences, right? And is there any way to restart, maybe I'm saying too mechanical, but is there any way to restart people or mind? And the second question is, as I understood, different part of mind, they have a specific functionality. What will happen if you just cut that part of the mind? Does another part start to, do that functionality, or the human or that people don't have that things anymore?
Okay, I'm first going to go into your second question, because it's a little bit easier. So what you're asking about is a phenomenon called cortical plasticity, which usually involves when damage to the cortex in particular occurs, can other parts, not part of the cortex, when damage to your eyes, for example, occurs, can your visual cortex perhaps take over all sorts of visual or auditory functions, which would then boost your auditory abilities, for example? Is that sort of what you're asking? Yeah. So these studies have definitely been done, and it turns out that yes is the simple answer. The more nuanced answer is that there are parts of our visual cortex that are particularly good at solving visual problems. So if you think about it in terms of an information processing standpoint, if you have to solve the same problem but with a different type of visual input, you will always recruit the same cortical area. So we have this area that is known, for example, as the fusiform face area. It lights up when I show people faces. And all these neurons there get very excited in terms of categorizing this. But if someone doesn't see faces anymore, but for example would feel faces, probably it would involve the exact same part of what is normally considered visual cortex in terms of dissociating faces from one another. So yes and no. Yes, parts of the cortex can take it over, but they usually end up solving the same problems just with different types of information. Now, when it comes to resetting someone's mind, there are probably some Oliver Sacks books about people getting all sorts of blows to the head that lead to this type of phenomenology, but I'm not too sure about how this would work based on just these case studies. So I'm not so sure.
Well, as a short comment on that, this is a bit of a footnote to it. That is a treatment for depression, which actually Well, it's sort of based on the idea that can't we reset the brain, and that is electroconvulsion therapy, where people with, and this is really severe depression where no other treatment has succeeded so far, and psychiatrists don't know what else could help, then that might be that could be an option. And what happens is that people get shocks to their brain. And what we see happening is that, well, first of all, people's depressive symptoms typically become better. This doesn't happen for everyone, but for quite a few people, they have fewer depressive symptoms. What we also see is that part of the brain, the hippocampus, is actually growing in those people. And at the University Medical Center, we are trying to understand how this is happening, because the idea is that perhaps we are rewiring the brain, perhaps we are destroying these old connections that had these negative thoughts, and we have new paths again, new paths that are open to also remember positive experiences more strongly. So this is an addition to the rewiring the brain.
I think we have 2 more questions from the audience.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about the memory and this the interference process you spoke about. Which is the effect in other type of learning, not only processes related with the movement and the cognitive and the understanding of the question. Like for learning, are those memory interfering for the future or changing, for example, a concept?
So I'm not 100% sure if I'm going to answer your question, but I can also just talk about something else.
Briefly then.
What I wanted to highlight mostly is that these influences from these episodic memories, they happen and we're usually not aware of them. So in a lot of these preparation studies and a lot of these visual search studies that I've done, I've explicitly told people, you were probably not aware of it, but you just got really good at something. Now it no longer helps you, so stop doing it. And these types of instructions, they're completely ineffective. So participants are unable to listen to what I tell them to do, and instead they are biased by what their memory tells them to do. This sounds pretty radical, so I should emphasize that we're still talking about searching for red or green diamonds and pressing a button at the right moment in time. But these things can have pretty dire consequences in the sense that we believe that a lot of racial biases or other stereotypes that govern our thought are actually driven by these intrusive memories from previous negative experiences or from news exposure that affect our thinking, affect our cognitive abilities, without us being particularly aware of it. There is a pretty classic study from a lab assistant with glasses who was actually an actress, and people would come into the basement and they would do some sort of random task, and the lab assistant would either be very mean to them or be very polite to them. And then at the end of the experiment, participants got a sheet with 2 pictures, one of a woman with glasses and one of a woman without glasses, completely different women. And they were asked, so which one of these do you think looks more representative or nice as a new lab assistant? And participants would consistently choose the glasses in cases where the original lab assistant with glasses was nice, or they would move away from the woman with glasses if the participant or the lab assistant with glasses had not been nice. So there are all sorts of implicit memories of past events that do indeed, I think, govern our thought. There's not much we can do about it, other than just to be hyper aware of them and maybe not, maybe think about where your opinions come from.
Goedenavond, ik doe het graag in het Nederlands. Ik heb veel van uw lezing gemist omdat ik dover blijkt te zijn dan dat ik dacht, zelfs hier vooraan. Ik heb een jaar in Dennenoord gezeten waar ik niks meer van weet. En omdat ze niks meer me konden, hebben ze me naar het academisch gestuurd. En daar hebben ze me onder dwang 14 elektroshocks gegeven. En dan kom je zonder hersens naar buiten. Dus ik ben een heleboel dingen weer aan het leren. Maar een van de dingen waar ik tegenaan loop is dat ik waarschijnlijk een waterpasmens ben. En daar bedoel ik mee dat als iets maar een heel klein beetje scheef is, dan merk ik dat ik een bepaald soort angst en paniek krijg. Omdat ik jullie verhaal niet kon volgen, ga ik omheen kijken en dan denk ik, nou, dat is waterpas, dat is waterpas. En die vind ik dan een beetje scheef hangen, maar ik weet niet of het echt zo is. En ik vraag me dus af in hoeverre het niet waterpas zijn, gekoppeld aan onrust of angst, te onderzoeken is.
Ja, jullie.
To translate this question for you in English. So, well, thank you first of all for telling your story. So she told about her experiences, which were that she received electroconvulsion therapy, which I just talked about, and she experienced some memory loss after that. She's been in treatment, and she asked a question. She has the idea that she's sensitive to things should be exactly horizontal, and the question is how things being exactly horizontal relates to feelings of anxiety, and whether we would be able to study that. This is a very difficult and interesting question. To be honest, I'm not a doctor. I don't have a clear answer to this. Do we have any doctors or any people in the room who might be able to answer this question?
Well, I do think that in research, indeed, this could be, if this would be for you, your cue, and also something that you that kind of gives some peace of mind or rest, because it's perpendicular. I prefer maybe to answer in Dutch, but I think, of course, this can be studied, whether things that you prefer to be straight are not straight, that provokes anxiety. That of course we can study, and then also what could then be studied is what helps you maybe calm that down or not be so fixated on that. So maybe also learn to look on other things or interpret it as not a cue of something signaling something anxiety provoking. So also I'm happy to talk to you in Dutch about after that, because then we do this for a form. But thank you. Audrey, if I may ask the last question, because I was intrigued, you talked a lot about shame as well, or a lot, you mentioned shame. And then I was wondering, also teenagers, when they grow up, they develop a sense of more like how they are being perceived by others, and indeed shame is an emotion that kind of is very prevalent. Do you think that we start at completely the wrong age in teaching French, for example?
So we know about the younger the better, right? And in a way...
But because of this, or not?
Well, the younger the better, also because your brain is very flexible when you are at a younger age, really 3, 4, and so there is a very big discussion about the sensitive age around 7 years old. After that age, you wouldn't be able to learn a second language as well as your mother tongue. And it's a big debate because we don't really know exactly what happens. But what we see is that in the Netherlands, schools who offer English at 4-year-old, so there are schools like that, and there are schools that offer English at 10-year-old. In fact, the 10-year-olds, they outperform the 4-year-old very fast.
Okay.
Because they are cognitively further, so they can remember words much easier, etc. But what they don't outperform them on is on pronunciation.
Okay. Yeah.
And to dare to say something.
Okay.
So to feel at ease. And that's really a big difference. When you start younger, you develop also this curiosity for the other.
Yeah.
And there are schools in Friesland now, they're called the 3M schools, and there are multilingual schools. In these schools, there is a lot of awareness for foreign languages. And those kids there, they are exposed to many different languages. And what we see is that at a later age, they are more interested in learning many other languages.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank you for daring to share your work in your non-native language for all of you. I also would like to thank you for your daring to ask questions. I think we now have learned that daring makes you learn, otherwise, and there's no fun without daring and without learning. We're almost at the end of the evening, but I started also introducing these beautiful posters that are on the hallway. They're part of a project called Wetenschap op Woensdag, and I'd like to ask Franciska to talk a bit about that project, and also invite then the people to look around and have a look at them at their own pace.
Well, as you may have noticed during this Q&A session, we are able to answer some of your questions, but not everything. And at this moment, neuroscientists that study the brain at the University Medical Center and at the University of Groningen are working, I'd say day and night, but mostly at the day, on how your brain is working, how does it function, because you have questions, we have questions, and we want to know. Sometimes it's just a pity that we do so much brilliant research and no one really hears about it, and we wanted to change that. We wanted to bring the neuroscience to the people. And we thought, well, we might need a bit of aesthetics for that. What if we had artworks with the brain facts? So we invited people, researchers from the University Medical Center and University of Groningen to send in their brain facts. So these are some things they found in their research. And then we went with those brain facts to Academy Minerva, which has brilliant art students. And we asked them, well, these are neuroscience findings. Can you make an artwork of that? And they said, absolutely, we're going to do that. And they came up with 50 brilliant, beautiful artworks. And in the exhibition, Brainstorm, you are able to see all of those artworks together with all of the brain facts. And starting from tomorrow onwards, we will post these brain facts and the artworks every Wednesday. That's why the project is called Science on Wednesday. So people can learn about our beautiful brain and together with these beautiful artworks. As a sneak preview, you will have posters on the hallway where you can already see the first brain facts and the artworks. Please follow us on the social media and come to the exhibition, of course. And if you have any questions about them, feel free to ask. Thank you very much.
So find Wetenschap op Woensdag on LinkedIn and Instagram and Facebook. We're still on. Okay, there will be a QR code later. So thanks. This is the end of the evening. Thanks again to all speakers and you. And next interesting event from Studium Generale is the Kenniscafé. So that's the Knowledge Café on living with water. That will be on the 27th of this month. Also, next to the discount code for visiting the museum exhibition, you will receive a survey and you can answer some questions about Studium Generale and what we offer you. So that is the end of it. I wish you a very nice evening and thanks for spending your evening with us.